Hello! Today I'm taking a brief look at the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is creeping ever closer to its expected release date of March 2020, and building increasing anticipation along the way. As such, this is something of a discussion piece based on footage and current Square statements available, and if you'd like the extremely abridged summary of my thoughts without delving into the details here, I would call it building excitement, tempered by a cautious optimism. Whether you're a veteran fan of the series or a relative newcomer, you will be aware by now that Square tend to hit as often as they miss, and radically divide opinion with each of their Final Fantasy releases. And I think the reputation and expectation built up in the latter 1990s with the concurrent hits of Final Fantasy VII, VIII and IX gave them a degree of esteem and prestige that some argue they've never quite been able to live up to since. In many ways, the Final Fantasy VII Remake could be considered a response to this, and many regarded its premature announcement back in 2015 as much a move to appease shareholders and rekindle interest in Square's flagship title, as it was an exciting step forward for the lineage of JRPG video games. And some even questioned whether Square's perceived inability to return to form should instead see them focus exclusively on remakes of not just 7, but all their past successes such as 6, 8, 9 and 10. And once again, this is merely the divided opinion of Final Fantasy's, ever-expanding fan base. But on a personal note, providing that the 7 Remake lives up to expectations, as a fan, I would totally be on board with seeing remakes of those aforementioned earlier titles. So, without getting ahead of ourselves, let's look briefly now at the pros and cons of what we've seen of the remake so far. And kicking off with the obvious, and what stood out most, is that the character models and settings have been beautifully and painstakingly reconstructed. And at least from an aesthetic standpoint, I think the reimagining of primary and secondary characters, from Cloud and Barrett right through to Biggs, Wedge and Jessie, have been very well done. There has been some minor controversy around Tifa's memories, and the obvious reduction in size that's gone on there, and on the one hand, a more toned physique seems appropriate and perhaps more realistic for an intensely trained and nutritioned martial artist. And if we look at Olympic gymnasts as an analogue, we can see that, bodies develop according to the demanding physical activities that they undertake. And Tifa would be no exception to this. But on the other hand, we have to appreciate that generations of adolescent young men have grown up anticipating the prospect of a remake, partly to see Tifa's breasts painstakingly rendered in current gen technology, and I think many feel quite snubbed by this revelation, which has prompted the whole controversy in the first place. For me, personally, I didn't mind either rendition of Tifa. She's one of my favourite Final Fantasy characters regardless of that aspect of her character, and I think I'm more concerned with them messing with her story and messing with her agenda throughout the game, as of course the love triangle between Cloud, Tifa and Ares was a player determinant and interesting aspect of the original, and I'd be more concerned if they were to tamper with that, rather than her aesthetics. And frankly, despite recent provocative character designs such as Cindy from Final Fantasy XV, Square's almost certainly reconsidered Tifa to reflect the changing gaming demographics and opinions that's taken place over the past decade or so. And although I love Tetsuya Nomura's work, his almost hentai leanings with Tifa's original conception is very much a product of the 90s and very much a product of Japan, which perhaps wouldn't go down well today, from a universal marketability perspective, which I'm sure that Square is acutely aware of. And digressing slightly on this note, I think that Lara Croft's redesign in the Tomb Raider games over recent years is another prominent example of this change of tact, I think. Moving on, but in keeping with character design, they have not only been met with modernisation, but also westernisation, as since Final Fantasy X, the series has increasingly entered into the Western gaming mainstream. For the remake, Italian artist Roberto Ferrari, who was responsible for the excellently designed Ardyn in Final Fantasy XV, Ferrari's joined up with Tetsuya Nomura, so I'm confident that this partnership, as well as what we've already seen of the game, is going to result in some excellently realised recreations of our favourite characters. And I don't know why, but of all the characters that I could get worked up about, I'm really interested to see how Bugenhagan pans out, because, you know, in the original, of course, he's this weird floating guy, and it's kind of hard to make out his actual features. So it will be interesting to see what's retained, what's changed, and what's discarded regarding, you know, secondary characters like this, with Don Corneo, Dio, and Dine being other interesting examples of secondary inclusions to the story. But once again, I feel positively towards this, and recent trailers, for example, have shown a glimpse of Heidegger, who, along with Biggs, Wedge and Jesse, all look absolutely fantastic. So I'm quite confident that the visual recreations are going to be quite strong. One thing that I haven't really seen discussed, and I think will have a significant impact on the way that we perceive this game and its characters, is the introduction of voice acting. And the reason it hasn't been addressed so much is that voice acting has subtly crept into the cast of Final Fantasy VII over the years, with Advent Children, Dirge of Cerberus, you know, Crisis Core, and a host of other releases and cameos and that sort of thing, fleshing them out and gradually acclimatizing us to the fact that these characters, and primarily, you know, the main party, that they speak and how they speak. For my part, as I mentioned some time ago in my Final Fantasy X review, I've always been on the fence with voice acting, because when it's done well, it's excellent. But in many respects, it robs the player of the ability to create a character and their specific personality in their mind, because of course a lot of personality is conveyed through voice. And Final Fantasies were traditionally very good for allowing you to perceive characters how you liked, because of course it was text on a screen. For example, to show, you know, a positive and a subjectively negative, you know, example of this, I think the Final Fantasy VII cast is by and large very well voice acted. But when I first heard Sid Highwind speaking in this grouchy Texan twang sort of accent, it completely jarred with the image that I had of him in my mind's eye. And opening this out and looking at the wider remake of Final Fantasy VII, it leads one to consider, you know, what does Don Corneo sound like? What does Scarlet sound like? Or President Shinra sound like? Because despite being less important characters, I'm sure that we all each have an image of them constructed in our mind's eye, and it's a complex thing for Square not to contradict these expectations in one way or another, you know, by introducing, you know, voice acting as an element. So, moving swiftly on, beyond the look and feel of characters and setting, we've had a glimpse of gameplay and battle system, which, much like other Square RPGs, such as Kingdom Hearts, Crisis Core, and Final Fantasy XV, have been inching in some form or another to a more immediate active battle mechanic for quite some time. For my part, although I'm a veteran of the series and freely admit that I love playing turn-based titles, you know, from the early days, I am also completely on board with the Kingdom Hearts style of gameplay too. Again, at this stage it's hard to tell to what extent it's been evolved and how radically gameplay departs from other titles, but the battle system looks very cool from what I've seen, and several other screenshots have shown Cloud crawling and climbing and shuffling around obstacles. So I think we can assume that action has become a much more predominant facet of gameplay across the board here. I will note, however, that I was in a comic book shop the other day discussing the Final Fantasy Kai Arts figures with a guy that worked there, and he showed me a pre-order bundle for the remake that he'd purchased, and it comes with this figurine of Cloud on the motorbike. But what I noticed while he was showing me his pre-order bundle is that it also came with some DLC summons included. And I've mentioned DLC content extensively across Final Fantasy, Tekken, and various other discussions, and it's something that I'm very dubious about when it comes at the expense of either game story or game reward. For example, in Tekken 7, rather than unlock a series of secret characters by beating the game, you unlock them by paying Namco to download them, which has rendered the arcade mode of the game, you know, obsolete, and Tekken is basically now an online peer-to-peer fighting game these days, and it's not good for anything else. So, turning to Final Fantasy VII, if the remake leans towards DLC materia and summons, it's going to take considerable fun out of beating bosses, doing side quests and other such things that we would traditionally have done to try and acquire them, with, you know, the infamous Knights of the Round being a prime example. Now, Many people may be fine with this, and perhaps I'm just reaching a point where my idea of gaming is quite outmoded and unmodern. But I feel that there's a fine line between purchase-worthy DLC that augments a game experience with, a developer's hard-earned time and effort being put into a game scenario, and then DLC that seems to kind of be a bit of a cash grab, for want of a better word. I digress. And again, this is just something that I observed on this guy's pre-order bundle. Of course, I doubt all of the summons are going to be DLC, but the proportion of what is DLC and what is not remains to be seen. So, from the visuals and trailers available, I'm entirely on board with the remake aesthetically, and to be honest, graphical splendour is the one area in which Square has always prevailed and pushed the envelope in terms of innovation. Turning now to narrative and story, of which we've been sparsely informed, we know that the first and potentially the second instalment of what has been proposed is going to hinge around Midgar, and the footage available correlates to this, as it's mostly Cloud running around a reactor or on a train with the Avalanche crew. Square have also announced that the story is going to change, and while essential plot points are going to remain the same, there's going to be plenty of in-between stuff that's adapted or outright changed from the original release of the game. And there's a few reasons why this might be, and a few concerns that potentially might emerge from this, which I will address directly. So, having recently discussed Zack Fair in a character analysis episode, I concluded by stating that I wouldn't be surprised if elements of Zack's now fully fleshed out backstory would find their way into the remake, either by way of cameo or retcon. And I think some more allusions to Shinra's illegitimate son Lazard, allusions to Genesis, Angeal, the Buster Sword, all of this stuff might play a part here, along with some of the Crisis Core locations, such as Benora. I further mentioned that where Aerith or Aeris doesn't seem to remember or mention Zack much in the original, this might need to be addressed because the relationship established over the course of Crisis Core would make it unrealistic for Zack not to be featured or discussed more apparently in the events of Final Fantasy VII proper. And to be honest, I am completely on board with this, providing it's implemented well, because of course the dichotomy here is that Cloud doesn't remember Zack, and he's appropriated these elements of him. So it's going to be quite a tricky story to retell in the wake of the events of Crisis Core. One way it could be done, of course, is Cloud having periodic migraines and ambiguous flashbacks to Zack at the mention of his name, or something like this, which once again could be the case because recent trailers have shown him conversing with an image of Sephiroth in a burning reactor, so it could be along these lines. Indeed, we could even see Final Fantasy VIII style flashback segments where we're actually controlling Zack, which would be really cool. And for those that listened to my Ultimania review, you'll remember that in the early concepting stages for Final Fantasy VII, they actually had that dual timeline gameplay included, which they later scrapped, and was eventually used for Squall and Laguna's story in Final Fantasy VIII. So it's interesting that that was originally a facet of Final Fantasy VII that they may legitimately return to for one reason or another. So, moving on to mild concern, which may just be me being pedantic. It seems like some story elements and characterizations have been outright changed and somewhat contradict what we know about characters and their motivations from the original release. For example, some remake footage shows an exchange between Barrett and Cloud, where Barrett berates him, saying, "Are you going to stand there and pretend you can't hear the planet crying out in pain?" Which prompts a comical response from Cloud, which I find slightly concerning because, firstly, the whole personification of the planet doesn't get discussed or put forth by Barrett, but rather it comes later in the game by Bugenhagen, who states this when we meet him in Cosmo Canyon in a somewhat spiritual reveal. We find out more about Gaia. Having Barrett preaching and describe the planet crying out in pain and indulging this worldview not only undermines the entire Bugenhagen dialogue and the purpose of visiting Cosmo Canyon in the first place, but it also undermines Barrett's characterization and agenda, which I've mentioned previously in my Dyne and Barrett character analysis. Barrett is a member of Avalanche, not so much because he wants to save the planet, but as much, if not more so, because he wants to take revenge on Shinra for the loss of his wife, his friends, and his hometown of Coral. The image of Barrett as a planet-saving freedom fighter is merely a facade that drops sharply once we meet Dine in the desert prison, and we realise that Barrett harbours this vengeful intent following his harrowing backstory. So, I may be reading a little bit too much into what is essentially a line of dialogue, and as Square have stated that they've changed the story, maybe Barrett somehow knows Bugenhagen or, has this worldview from some other source. Who knows? My only apprehension is that they erode the significance of certain character arcs and locations, because in the original release, as I've said, Barrett is defined by and developed by his anger and need for revenge, and Cosmo Canyon is defined by its spiritual, almost Buddhist reveal of the personified planet and the interconnectedness of all things, which is delivered once again by Bugenhagen in his observatory. So, having Barrett drop this, planet crying out in pain line in the opening bombing mission seems really quite strange for me, and it seems like they're not allowing this story to naturally develop as it originally did, because they're assuming that everyone's already aware of it. Moving on, but in keeping with story, another discussion point comes with Square announcing that the initial release will take place entirely in Midgar, which gives an indication of the scale and scope of this remake, but also some lingering questions as to how many episodes this game will have, and even whether any more of it has entered concept or production yet. The concern here is that we'll either have a lopsided game where Midgar's absolutely huge, but then delays with currently non-existing content will have Square rush out a haphazard, half-finished game due to demand, cobbled together posthumously by DLC content, which sounds somewhat familiar, but it would be an absolute nightmare for players. Another not so much concern, but an observation, is that if Midgar is 20 plus hours long, and Square make the rest of the game proportionate to this, i.e. Midgar being 1/3 of the opening act, then we are dealing with a game that will take several years to release and, several years for audiences to complete. And the question of sustained interest and potential cancellations looms over this sort of thing, as analogues in television, movie and the book industry show us, with a classic example being, Game of Thrones, or, A Song of Ice and Fire, the novels Game of Thrones is based on, of which we've waited almost a decade for the penultimate and concluding books to come out, and at the time of this episode that I'm recording now, we're still waiting to see the penultimate book released. So having this happen with a Final Fantasy VII Remake would be, again, an absolute nightmare for players. So, relating back to this premature announcement of Final Fantasy VII, the more pessimistic side of me feels that Square have put themselves under unnecessary pressure, because they are now having to release something to maintain interest, when they really haven't looked beyond this to consider what comes next. And indeed, Yoshinori Kitase stated at E3 when he was asked about the rest of the game, and I quote here, "We decided we are going to focus this game on Midgar and what happened in Midgar, and unfortunately, we can't say anything more about future games after that, because we don't know ourselves. We really are still fleshing out that process, and fleshing out what we're going to do for the second game in the project, and what kind of story is going to be in that. So we really can't tell you." So, while it's great Midgar is getting this huge reimagining, I'm hoping it's not at the expense of what comes next, because one of the most memorable experiences of Final Fantasy VII is standing at the end of that obsolete road in the sunset, having just battled Motorball, and you're realising that you're leaving the morbid, lengthy Midgar segment behind in favour of the big wide world. And I'm sure that this, along with the motorbike chase that precedes it, will be a fantastic aspect of the remake, but I just want to feel confident that what comes next will live up to this introductory instalment that Square doesn't seem to have looked beyond just yet. And while I have a feeling that if, for whatever reason, the first instalment of the remake bombs or meets with severe criticism, they will probably just weave in a self-contained ending and call it Final Fantasy Midgar, and just can the whole thing. But that's me playing devil's advocate, and I think it's pretty unlikely that that will happen. So let's wait and see. As an addendum, many people are starting to discuss what they want to see included, with chocobo racing, cloud dressing up, the love triangle, and various other bits, of the original that are being demanded by fans. With the remake set to alter elements of story, it's fair to say that some elements of the game will be at risk, although they have said that cloud cross-dressing will be featured. But for my part, if I don't see Red 13 in a sailor's outfit, walking on hind legs, trying to pass as a human, I'm going to be very disappointed. So, those have been my few points and what I think of the remake so far. As I mentioned earlier, I'm excited and I'm cautiously optimistic, and I feel that Square have a real opportunity here to deliver an epic game story to a new generation of gamer and revitalise the series for veterans that grew up playing it. Everything I've seen so far gives me confidence. It's simply what I'm not seeing. Square's comments that they don't have an ongoing plan, and their recent reliance on DLC content, that has me erring on the side of caution slightly here. So, that about does it. What are your thoughts on the remake so far? Drop a comment, start a conversation. And as always, hit like and hit subscribe to keep updated with my latest posts.